Captain Jonathan Blake had been standing guard at the entrance to 10 Downing Street for exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes when he saw her approaching. Through the crowd of tourists and protesters, even from a distance, he could recognize the familiar way she walked, the particular tilt of her head when she was upset, and the determined stride that meant she was on a mission. It was his wife. Sarah. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, but his face remained completely expressionless. His training had been thorough, no matter what happened around him, no matter who approached. A guard on duty at one of Britain's most important government buildings never broke character. Not for friends, not for family, not for anyone. Sarah was still 50 yards away. Pushing through the crowd of people gathered outside the Prime Minister's residence, Jonathan could see that something was terribly wrong. Her usually perfect blonde hair was disheveled, her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and she was clutching her phone in one hand while wiping tears from her cheeks with the other. Jonathan and Sarah had been married for 6 years, and in all that time, he had rarely seen her cry. She was strong, independent, and capable of handling almost any crisis with calm determination. Whatever had brought her here, to his workplace, while he was on duty, had to be serious. The other tourists began to notice the distressed woman making her way toward the famous black door. Some took photos, probably thinking she was part of some dramatic scene or protest. Others whispered among themselves, wondering if she was someone important. Jonathan's training kicked in automatically. His feet remained planted exactly shoulder-width apart, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But inside, his mind was racing. Sarah knew his work schedule better than anyone. She knew he was on duty today. She knew the strict protocols that governed his behavior while guarding government property for her to come here. Like this, something catastrophic must have happened. As Sarah got closer, Jonathan could see that she was talking to herself, or perhaps practicing what she was going to say. Her lips were moving, and she kept looking at her phone, then back at him. The tears were flowing more freely now. Several concerned bystanders had started to approach her, probably wanting to offer help. "Miss, are you all right?" asked an elderly gentleman with a kind face. "Do you need assistance?" Sarah barely acknowledged him, her eyes locked on Jonathan. She was now close enough that he could see the desperation in her expression. It's the way her hands were shaking as she clutched her phone. "Jonathan," she called out, her voice breaking with emotion. "Jonathan, please. I need to talk to you. It's about Emma. Emma, their 5-year-old daughter." Jonathan felt his world tilt on its axis, but his body remained perfectly still. Emma was supposed to be at school today, safe in her classroom with Mrs. Patterson. Learning about colors and numbers and making friends with the other children, Sarah was now standing directly in front of him, tears streaming down her face, but Jonathan couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even acknowledge that he recognized her. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice desperate. "I know you're working, but this is about Emma," the school called. "There's been an accident." The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Every instinct screamed at him to break protocol, to grab Sarah and demand to know what had happened to their little girl. But his training held him frozen in place. Sarah reached out as if to touch his arm, then stopped herself, remembering where they were and what his job required of him. "The hospital needs us both there immediately," they said. ... Her voice broke completely, and she covered her face with her hands. Sobbing, Jonathan's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he had heard her. Around them, the crowd was growing larger as people sensed that something dramatic was unfolding. Camera phones appeared, recording what they thought might be some kind of protest or public demonstration. "Sir, this woman seems to know you," said another onlooker, a middle-aged woman with concern in her voice. "She's clearly in distress. Shouldn't someone help her?" But Jonathan couldn't respond, couldn't move, couldn't even look down at his wife as she stood there, broken and desperate, needing him more than she had ever needed him before. The protocol was clear and absolute. While on guard duty at government buildings, no personal interactions were permitted. No exceptions. Not for emergencies, not for family crises, not even for matters of life and death. Sarah looked up at him through her tears, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that instant, Jonathan saw not just his wife's pain, but her understanding of the impossible position he was in. She knew the rules as well as he did. She knew what his career meant to their family's future, but she also knew that their daughter needed her father. "Jonathan, I'm begging you," Sarah said. Her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the immediate area. Emma fell from the playground equipment. "They don't know how badly she's hurt. The ambulance took her to St. Mary's Hospital. They need both parents there to sign consent forms for surgery." Surgery. The word echoed in Jonathan's mind like a gunshot. His 5-year-old daughter. His precious little girl who still believed in fairy tales and insisted on wearing her pink tutu to bed every night. Needed surgery. Jonathan's commanding officer, Major Williams, was stationed just inside the building and could see everything through the security monitors. He had been watching the situation develop with growing concern, but protocol was protocol. Guards were not permitted to abandon their posts under any circumstances. Regardless of personal emergencies, Sarah pulled out her phone and showed the screen to Jonathan, holding it close enough for him to see without actually touching him. It was a text message from the hospital. Emergency surgery required. Both parents must be present immediately. Time sensitive. Room 347. The crowd around them was growing restless. What had started as curious observation was becoming something closer to a public spectacle. People were taking photos and videos, posting to social media with captions like, "Guard refuses to help crying woman and heartless. Security ignores a distressed wife. This is ridiculous," said a young man in a business suit who had stopped to watch. "Can't you see she needs help? What kind of person just stands there when someone is obviously in crisis?" An older woman shook her head in disgust. "These guards think they're so important with their fancy uniforms, but they have no compassion. That poor woman is clearly his wife or girlfriend, and he won't even look at her." Sarah heard the comments from the growing crowd, and fresh tears began to flow. She understood Jonathan's position better than any of these strangers, but that didn't make it easier to bear. Her daughter was lying in a hospital bed, possibly fighting for her life, and she couldn't get the one person she needed most to even acknowledge her existence. "I know you can hear me," Sarah said, stepping closer to Jonathan. "I know this is killing you inside, but Emma is asking for her daddy. She's scared and confused, and the doctors say the surgery needs to happen within the next hour." Jonathan's hands, still clasped behind his back, were now gripping each other so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool October weather. Major Williams had called for backup, knowing that the situation was attracting too much attention. Within minutes, 2 additional guards arrived to assess the situation and provide crowd control if necessary, "Ma'am. You need to step back from the guard," one of the new arrivals said to Sarah. "This is a secure government facility, and you're causing a disturbance." "I'm not causing a disturbance," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "I'm trying to tell my husband that our daughter is in the hospital. This isn't about your security. This is about a little girl who needs her father." The guard looked. He was uncomfortable but maintained his professional demeanor. "I understand this is a difficult situation, but the guard on duty cannot respond to personal matters. If this is a genuine emergency, you should contact his commanding officer through proper channels." "Proper channels?" Sarah's voice rose with incredulous anger. "My 5-year-old is about to go into surgery, and you want me to fill out paperwork and wait for approval? How is that proper?" The crowd was now openly taking sides. Some people supported Jonathan, arguing that duty and discipline were important values that shouldn't be abandoned for personal reasons. Others condemned him as heartless and inhuman for ignoring his family's crisis. "He's just doing his job," said a veteran wearing military medals on his jacket. "You civilians don't understand what it means to have that kind of responsibility. If every guard abandoned their posts whenever they had a personal emergency, how could we trust them to protect important facilities?" "That's his wife and child," shouted back a woman with a small daughter of her own. "No job is more important than family. What good is protecting a building if you lose everything that matters to you?" Sarah looked around at the arguing crowd, then back at her husband. She could see the tension in his jaw, the rigid way he was holding his shoulders, the almost imperceptible trembling in his hands. She knew he was fighting the biggest battle of his life, torn between his sworn duty and his love for his family, making a decision that would haunt her for years to come. Sarah stepped directly in front of Jonathan and looked up into his eyes. "I'm going to the hospital now," she said quietly, her voice steadying with resolve. "I'm going to sign whatever papers need to be signed, and I'm going to hold Emma's hand when she goes into surgery. But she's going to ask where her daddy is, and I don't know what I'm going to tell her." Sarah's words hung in the air like a challenge and a goodbye all at once. Jonathan felt something crack inside his chest, but his military training held him rigid as a statue. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, with some calling for him to go to his family and others defending his dedication to duty. "Emma asked me to bring you her favorite teddy bear," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible now. She pulled a small, well-worn brown bear from her purse, Mr. Buttons. "Emma's constant companion since she was 2 years old. She said Daddy would want to hold him while she's getting better." The sight of the teddy bear nearly broke Jonathan's composure. He could picture Emma clutching Mr. Buttons during thunderstorms, carrying him to their bed when she had nightmares, introducing him to every new person she met. Now, their little girl was lying in a hospital bed, and she had sent her most precious possession to comfort the father who couldn't be. Their Major Williams appeared at the entrance to the building, his face stern but his eyes showing the conflict he felt about the situation. He had served with Jonathan for 4 years and knew him to be one of the most dedicated and reliable guards in the unit. He also knew that Jonathan was a devoted father who talked about Emma constantly during their off-duty hours. "Mrs. Blake," Major Williams said formally, approaching the group, "I understand there's been a family emergency. However, I'm sure you realize that Guard Blake cannot abandon his post during his assigned duty hours. If you'd like to file a request through proper military channels, ... Major Williams," Sarah interrupted, her voice gaining strength from her anger and desperation. "With all due respect, my daughter doesn't have time for proper channels. She's 5 years old, she's terrified, and she's about to undergo emergency surgery. Your protocols won't mean anything if she dies while we're following procedure." The crowd murmured its approval of Sarah's words, but Major Williams remained unmoved. "I sympathize with your situation, Mrs. Blake, but national security protocols exist for a reason. We cannot make exceptions, no matter how compelling the circumstances." "National security?" Sarah's voice rose. "This is the front door of a building, not a nuclear facility. My husband stands here and salutes people taking photos. Meanwhile, his daughter is lying in a hospital bed asking why Daddy isn't there." A news crew had arrived, alerted by social media posts about the dramatic scene unfolding at Downing Street. The reporter, a sharp-eyed woman named Jennifer Hayes, immediately recognized the story's potential and began setting up for a live broadcast. "This is Jennifer Hayes reporting from outside 10 Downing Street, where we're witnessing an extraordinary situation." She spoke into her microphone. "A Royal Guard is maintaining his post, despite his wife's desperate pleas for him to come to the hospital where their young daughter is, awaiting emergency surgery." The camera focused on Sarah, who was now holding Mr. Buttons against her chest while tears continued to stream down her face. The image was heartbreaking, a mother alone in her crisis while her husband stood mere feet away, unable or unwilling to help. Jonathan could hear the reporter's words, but he couldn't look at the camera, couldn't look at Sarah, couldn't look at the teddy bear that represented everything he was failing to protect. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, even as his heart was breaking into pieces. "Ma'am," the reporter approached Sarah with her microphone, "can you tell us what's happening with your daughter?" Sarah looked at the camera, then back at Jonathan. "Emma fell from the monkey bars at school. The doctors think she might have internal injuries, and they need to operate immediately. But they require both parents' consent and my husband." She gestured helplessly at Jonathan. "My husband is bound by military protocol. How do you feel about your husband's choice to remain at his post?" The reporter pressed Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking at Jonathan with a mixture of love and heartbreak. "I don't blame him," she said finally. "I know what his oath means to him. I know what this job means to our family's future. but I also know what our daughter means to us, and right now, she needs her father more than this building needs a guard." The live broadcast was being shared across social media platforms, with viewers from around the world weighing in on the moral dilemma. The hashtags #DutyV's family and #protocol first began trending, as people debated whether Jonathan was a hero of discipline or a heartless father. Major Williams received a call. On his secure phone, his superiors had seen the news coverage and were concerned about the negative publicity. The image of a guard refusing to help his own family was not the kind of story the military wanted associated with their personnel. "Guard Blake," Major Williams said quietly, approaching Jonathan. "I've been ordered to inform you that your situation has attracted significant media attention. The command wants you to know that whatever decision you make will be reviewed by your superiors." It was as close to permission as Jonathan was likely to get, a subtle indication that his commanders would understand if he chose to break protocol under these extraordinary circumstances. But Jonathan remained frozen, caught between two unbreakable codes: his military oath and his promise to Sarah on their wedding day to always be there. When she and their future children needed him most, Sarah took one last look at her husband, memorizing his face as if she might never see him again. Then she turned to walk away, clutching Mr. Buttons and heading toward the taxi that would take her to the hospital alone. Sarah had taken only 3 steps away from Jonathan when something unprecedented happened. For the first time in 4 hours and 52 minutes, Jonathan moved. It wasn't much, just a slight turn of his head, barely perceptible to most observers. But for a royal guard trained to remain absolutely motionless, it was like an earthquake. Sarah felt it more than saw it, that tiny shift that meant her husband was fighting the most difficult battle of his life. "Sarah," Jonathan whispered, his voice so quiet that only she could hear it. He had broken the first rule of guard duty he had spoken while on post. Sarah stopped walking but didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to look at him again if he wasn't going to come with her. The crowd sensed that something significant was happening and grew quiet. Straining to hear what might be said, Major Williams watched Jonathan carefully. Knowing that the next few moments would define the rest of the guard's military career, he had served long enough to understand that some moments transcended regulation and protocol. But he also knew that exceptions could not be made lightly. The news reporter continued her live broadcast, whispering into her microphone so as not to disturb the tense scene. "It appears that the guard may have just spoken to his wife, which would be a significant breach of protocol. This situation continues to develop as we watch." Jonathan's internal struggle was visible now to anyone who looked closely. The rigid military posture remained, but there was a tremor in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of a man being torn apart from the inside. He thought about Emma's first steps, how she had wobbled across their living room directly into his arms, giggling with pure joy. He thought about bedtime stories, her insistence that he check under the bed for monsters every single night, the way she would climb into their bed during storms and snuggle between him and Sarah. He thought about the promise he had made to Sarah during their wedding ceremony, when he had looked into her eyes and sworn to put their family first, always and forever. But he also thought about his oath as a royal guard, the solemn vow to protect and serve regardless of personal cost. He thought about the trust that had been placed in him, the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform, the knowledge that his failure could set a precedent that might compromise security for years to come. "Jonathan," Sarah said without turning around, her voice carrying just far enough for him to hear. "I understand why you can't come, but I need you to know that Emma understands too. I'll tell her that Daddy is being brave, just like the soldiers in her storybooks. I'll tell her that some people have jobs so important that they can't leave, even when they want to." Her words were meant to release him from guilt, but they only made the choice more agonizing. Sarah was giving him permission to stay, absolving him of blame. But he could hear the pain in her voice underneath her understanding words. The crowd was becoming restless again. The drama had reached a crescendo, and people wanted resolution. Some began calling out encouragement for Jonathan to go to his daughter. Others insisted that duty must come first. "Let him go," shouted a woman holding her own young child. Any father would choose his family. He swore an oath. Countered an older man wearing military medals. If he breaks it now, what good is his word? Major Williams made a decision that would be reviewed by his superiors for months to come. He approached Jonathan and spoke in a voice just loud enough for the immediate crowd to hear. "Guard Blake, you are hereby granted emergency family leave, effective immediately. Report to the hospital and return to base when the situation is resolved." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. But Jonathan remained frozen. Even with official permission, his training was so ingrained that he couldn't simply walk away from his post. The internal programming of months of discipline held him in place like invisible chains. Sarah finally turned around, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "Jonathan, did you hear him? You can come now. You can come with me." But Jonathan was staring straight ahead, seemingly unable to process what had just happened. The permission he had needed was given. But something deeper than training was holding him back now, the fear that once he abandoned his post, even with authorization, he would never be trusted with important responsibilities again. Major Williams recognized the paralysis that sometimes affected soldiers when faced with conflicting directives. He approached Jonathan and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Guard Blake, I am giving you a direct order. Report to St. Mary's Hospital immediately to assist your family with a medical emergency. Your post will be covered by replacement personnel. The magic words direct order cut through Jonathan's paralysis like a sword. Military training that had held him motionless now demanded that he obey his superior's command. For the first time in nearly 5 hours, Jonathan stepped out of position. The crowd's cheers grew louder as Jonathan began walking towards Sarah, his movements awkward and uncertain after so many hours of rigid stillness. Sarah ran the few steps between them and threw her arms around him, not caring that dozens of cameras were recording the moment. "Is she going to be okay?" Jonathan asked, his voice rough from hours of silence and emotional strain. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly, "but now we'll find out together." The taxi ride to St. Mary's Hospital passed in a blur of London streets and worried silence. Jonathan held Sarah's hand tightly, while she clutched Mr. Buttons with the other. Both of them lost in their own fears about what they might find when they arrived. "Tell me everything," Jonathan said as the taxi navigated through traffic. "What exactly happened at school?" Sarah took a shaky breath. "Emma was playing on the monkey bars during recess. According to her teacher, she made it across fine. But when she tried to do it a second time, she fell. She landed hard and couldn't get up. The teacher said she was conscious but complaining that her tummy hurt really badly." Jonathan felt sick imagining his little girl lying on the playground in pain. "How long ago was this?" 3 hours, Sarah replied. "I've been trying to reach you for 3 hours, but they wouldn't let me speak to you directly. I called the base. I called the emergency line. I even tried to get a message through Major Williams. But everyone kept saying you were on duty and couldn't be disturbed. I'm so sorry," Jonathan said, his voice thick with regret. "If I had known ... you would have done exactly what you did," Sarah finished for him. "Because that's who you are. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. Your sense of duty, your integrity. But it's also the reason I sometimes feel like I'm married to the uniform instead of the man." Her words stung because there was truth in them. Jonathan had always prided himself on his discipline and dedication. But he was beginning to understand that those qualities came at a cost that his family paid, along with him. The hospital came into view, and Jonathan felt his chest tighten with anxiety. In all his military training, nothing had prepared him for the possibility of losing his daughter. They rushed through the emergency room entrance. Jonathan still in his full Royal Guard uniform, which drew stares from other patients and hospital staff. Sarah led him directly to the information desk. "We're here about Emma Blake," Sarah said urgently. "She's 5 years old, brought in from Riverside Primary School. We were told she needs surgery. The receptionist checked her computer. Room 347, pediatric wing. Take the elevator to the 3rd floor and follow the blue line." As they hurried through the hospital corridors, Jonathan realized that the news coverage of their situation had preceded them. Hospital staff were whispering and pointing, and he could see people taking photos with their phones. Mr. and Mrs. Blake. A doctor in surgical scrubs approached them as they reached Emma's floor. I'm Dr. Patricia Reeves, pediatric surgeon. I've been waiting for both of you. How is she? Sarah and Jonathan asked simultaneously. Emma is stable, but she has internal bleeding from a ruptured spleen. It's serious but treatable. We need to operate within the next hour to repair the damage. The procedure has a very high success rate. But as with any surgery involving a child this young, there are risks we need to discuss. Dr. Reeves led them to a small consultation room and began explaining the surgical procedure, the risks involved, and the consent forms that needed to be signed. Jonathan listened intently, but part of his mind was still processing the fact that he had abandoned his post, something he had never imagined he would do. Can we see her before the surgery? Sarah asked. Of course. She's been asking for both of you. When they entered Emma's room, Jonathan's heart broke. His little girl looked so small and fragile in the large hospital bed, connected to 4 tubes and monitors. But when she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that reminded him why nothing else in the world mattered. Daddy, you came. Emma reached out her arms for a hug, wincing slightly from the movement. Jonathan carefully embraced his daughter, fighting back tears. Of course I came, sweetheart. Mommy told me you were having an adventure in the hospital. It's not a very fun adventure, Emma said seriously. My tummy hurts, and the doctors say they have to fix something inside me. But Mommy brought Mr. Buttons, and now you're here. So I think it will be okay. Sarah handed the teddy bear to Emma, who immediately clutched it against her chest. Mr. Buttons was keeping me company until Daddy could get here, she told. Jonathan, that was very thoughtful of Mr. Buttons, Jonathan replied, his voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Dr. Reeves returned to prepare Emma for surgery. As they wheeled her bed toward the operating room, Emma looked up at both her parents. Will you both be here when I wake up? She asked. Yes, Jonathan said firmly. We'll both be right here, even if your important job needs you. Jonathan looked down at his daughter, then at Sarah, and made a decision that felt like the most important one of his life. Emma, my most important job is being your daddy. Everything else comes second to that. As Emma was taken into surgery, Jonathan and Sarah settled into the waiting room. The news crews had followed them to the hospital. Jonathan could see reporters setting up outside the building. What happens now? Sarah asked quietly. To your career, I mean? Will there be consequences for leaving your post? Jonathan considered the question honestly. I don't know, probably. But right now I don't care. You were right earlier. What good is protecting a building if I lose everything that matters to me? For the first time in hours, Sarah smiled. That doesn't sound like the man who stood frozen while I begged him to come with me. Maybe, Jonathan replied. That man learned something today about what really deserves his protection. 3 hours later, Dr. Reeves emerged from the operating room with the news that Jonathan and Sarah had been praying for. Emma's surgery had been completely successful. The ruptured spleen had been repaired, the internal bleeding stopped, and their daughter was expected to make a full recovery. She's asking for both of you, Dr. Reeves said with a smile. She woke up about 10 minutes ago and immediately wanted to know if Daddy was still here. When they entered the recovery room, Emma was groggy from the anesthesia, but alert enough to recognize them. Mr. Buttons was tucked securely under her arm, and she managed a weak smile when she saw Jonathan still in his Royal Guard uniform. Daddy, did you get in trouble for leaving your important job? She asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. Jonathan sat carefully on the edge of her bed and took her small hand in his. You know what, sweetheart? Some things are more important than jobs. And you and Mommy are the most important things in my whole world. More important than protecting the Queen? Emma asked, her eyes wide. The Queen has lots of people to protect her, Jonathan replied. But you only have one daddy, and being your daddy is the most important job I'll ever have. Emma smiled and closed her eyes. Satisfied with his answer and ready to rest, over the next few days, as Emma recovered in the hospital, the story of the Royal Guard who chose family over protocol had spread around the world. The video of Sarah pleading with Jonathan and his eventual decision to leave his post had been viewed millions of times on social media. Public opinion was divided but largely sympathetic. Many people praised Jonathan for ultimately making the right choice, while others questioned whether military personnel could be trusted if they abandoned their duties for personal reasons. Major Williams visited the hospital on Emma's third day of recovery. He found Jonathan in the family lounge, still wearing his uniform because he hadn't been home to change clothes. "How is she?" Major Williams asked, sitting down across from Jonathan. "She's going to be fine," Jonathan replied. "The doctors say she can go home tomorrow." Major Williams nodded, then got to the difficult part of his visit. "We need to discuss your future with the Royal Guard, Blake. What happened at Downing Street has caused quite a stir up the chain of command." Jonathan straightened in his chair, preparing for the worst. "I understand, sir. I broke protocol, abandoned my post, and brought negative attention to the unit. I'm prepared to face the consequences." "Actually," Major Williams said. Surprising him, the consequences aren't what you might expect. The public response has been overwhelmingly positive. The military brass has decided that your actions, while technically a breach of protocol, demonstrate exactly the kind of character they want representing the Royal Guard. Jonathan looked confused. "I don't understand. You're being promoted to sergeant," Major Williams explained. "And you're being transferred to a new position developing family support protocols for military personnel. Facing emergency situations, your experience has highlighted gaps in our current system that need to be addressed." Jonathan was speechless. He had expected court-martial discharge, or at minimum, a significant demotion. Instead, he was being rewarded for what he had considered the greatest failure of his military career. "There's more," Major Williams continued. "Your story has led to policy changes throughout the entire military structure. New procedures are being implemented to ensure that personnel facing family emergencies can be quickly relieved of duty without compromising security." "What about the other guards?" Jonathan asked. "Won't this create problems for maintaining discipline?" Major Williams smiled. "Actually, recruitment applications have increased by 200% since your story broke. Young people want to serve alongside someone who demonstrates both professional dedication and human compassion. You've become a symbol of what modern military service should look like." 3 months later, Jonathan stood in a very different uniform at a very different post. As the new director of family crisis support for the Royal Guard, his job was to ensure that no other military family would face the impossible choice. That he and Sarah had confronted, Emma had recovered, completely from her surgery and delighted. In telling her classmates that her daddy was famous, she still carried Mr. Buttons everywhere and still insisted that Jonathan check under her bed for monsters every night. Sarah had taken a new job as a consultant helping military families navigate crises. Drawing on her experience from that terrible day at Downing Street, she and Jonathan had grown closer through the ordeal. Their marriage strengthened by having faced their worst fears together. The policy changes that Jonathan had inspired were being implemented across all branches of the British military. The Blake Protocol, as it came to be known, provided clear procedures for handling family emergencies without compromising operational security. On the first anniversary of Emma's accident, Jonathan received a letter that moved him to tears. It was from a young soldier stationed overseas whose wife had gone into premature labor. Thanks to the new protocols, the soldier had been immediately granted emergency leave and was able to be present for the birth of his infant daughter. "Because of what you did," the soldier wrote, "I was able to hold my little girl on the day she was born. Your courage to choose family over protocol has given the rest of us permission to be human while still serving our country with honor." Emma, now 6 and completely healthy, found Jonathan reading the letter in his study. She climbed onto his lap and looked at the official military letterhead. "Is this about when you got in trouble for coming to the hospital with me?" she asked. "I didn't get in trouble," Jonathan explained. "I learned something very important." "What did you learn?" Jonathan hugged his daughter close and looked at the family photo on his desks, Sarah smiling, Emma giggling. All of them together and healthy and safe. "I learned that the most important protocol of all is taking care of the people you love." Years later, When military historians studied the evolution of armed forces' family policies, they would point to Jonathan Blake's moment of choice as a turning point. But for Jonathan himself, the real victory wasn't the policy changes or the promotion or even the public recognition. The real victory was that when his daughter needed him most. He had found the courage to remember that being a good soldier and being a good father weren't contradictory goals. They were both expressions of the same fundamental commitment to protect what matters most.